So let's talk about what a programming language actually is. One of the reasons I find that people are very intimidated with learning programming is simply they don't understand what a programming language really is, and therefore all of this kind of sort of seems to be magic. And that's the thing, anything that you don't understand is going to be confusing, is going to be intimidating, but if you can start to get your mind around what you're actually trying to accomplish, you'll realize it may take a lot of work. I mean, it will take work to become a programmer, but it's not going to be nearly as insurmountable as you might think it would be initially. And so when we start looking at a programming language, whatever programming language you're looking at, the important thing to understand is that a programming language essentially is simply a computer program unto itself. This computer program is going to be used in order to complete certain tasks, right? So if you're used to using computer already, you will probably have used a Word or some kind of word processing program. You will have used some type of email program. You'll have used some type of QuickBooks or accounting program, right? So if you're going to be creating invoices, you would be using QuickBooks. If you're going to write a term paper, you would use Word. And if you're going to be sending somebody an email, that type of thing, you would use your email client, Gmail, or whatever else, right? And now the thing is, theoretically, you could write an entire term paper using QuickBooks, right? Basically, you could open QuickBooks, you could create an invoice, and in the invoice section, oh, lordy, lordy, you could sit there and you could type a term paper if you really wanted to. But that would be miserable for everybody involved, right? The same is true. You could open up a Word or some kind of word processing software and you could create your invoices that way. Not nearly as horrible as using QuickBooks in order to do a term paper, but also not very useful, right? It doesn't have any kind of back-end system to make sure whether or not people have paid their bills. It doesn't give you profit loss reports. It's just not a very good way of doing invoicing, especially if you have to do a lot of them, right? Again, with emails or whatever else, you could use your email client, again, to write a term paper, to write invoices or something like that, but that is just a horrible, horrible way to go about doing things. The same thing is true with programming language. All of these different programming languages that are out there, they are essentially computer programs that are designed to solve certain types of problems. So if you want to create an iOS app, right? So you have your iPhone, you want to create the next Angry Birds, something like that. There is a programming language called Swift. Swift is used to build iOS apps. Basically, if you want to create front-end environments or maybe web video games, that type of thing, there's a programming language called JavaScript. So this is something called a front-end programming language that is used in the web browser, and it allows basically when you go to a website, all that kind of dynamic content on the website, when you roll over something or you play a video game on a website, that's generally done with JavaScript. If you're going to be interacting with a database, so there's something called relational databases, we'll talk about later. Basically, if you're going to be inserting data into the database or pulling data out of the database, you would use a programming language called SQL, Structured Query Language, and that language is designed to specifically be able to interact with the database. So one of the big things that you need to be thinking about, again, when you start going to learn programming, is you need to think about what types of problems do you want to solve. Right? So if you want to create an iOS app, that's great, but you're probably not going to need to learn Java or C++. There's something called C++, right? If you're going to create an iOS app and you need to learn Swift, going off and learning C++ probably isn't going to get you to where you need to be. Again, if you want to build something on something called the Microsoft stack, so again, if you have a Microsoft environment with things like Active Directory and that type of thing, C# is the programming language for that particular environment. So you wouldn't want to use a different programming language. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of people get confused about is they come in and they say, I want to be a programmer. They learn some really random language and then they don't know what to do with that random language and then they get frustrated and give up. So the first thing to think about with these programming languages is that they are tools that are used to solve specific types of problems with computers. So the first thing that you need to do is figure out what type of problem that you want to solve, and then that will lead you to the type of programming language that you want to learn. Now, one of the big questions that comes up from all the students, basically is, Eli, what is the programming language that I need to learn to be successful? And the fact of the matter is you will most likely need to learn numerous programming languages to end up being successful. When you build out your platform, when you build out your project, there are a lot of programming languages that are going to come together in order to make that project be useful. Again, think about this from like the computer repair world, computer support world. Basically, if you give somebody a computer and it just has an operating system, literally just an operating system, that's not actually valuable. Again, think about in the computer support world, if somebody said, what program do I need to become an expert at in order to be successful? You're like, it's not really how that works, right? You need to understand how the operating system works. You're probably going to have to understand how Active Directory works if you're in that particular environment. You have to understand how email works. You have to make sure the word processor works properly. You have to make sure the accounting software works properly. You're going to need to understand a lot of different products in order to make even a single computer work, much less a network of computers. The same thing is true when you think about building a project with programming languages. So think about a web application. So let's say you want to go out there and you want to build a web application, again, the next dog dating app. You want dogs to be able to come together and date in harmony, right? And people dogs are going to be able to go and they're going to be able to use their web browser in order to be able to access this dog dating site. Well, the first programming language that you'll need to learn, or it's actually called a markup language. Again, there's a lot of languages out there. I'm generally going to call them programming languages. There's the purists get mad when I say that, but there's a lot of different languages, right? So there's something called HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. So when you go to a website, basically what HTML does is it gives you the framework for that website. What the title of the site is, when you look up at a tab and you see a little name up in the tab, that's done with HTML. Basically the headings in the website, tables in the website, HTML forms. If you're going to input data into a website, that's going to use something called an HTML form. And so basically HTML, hypertext markup language, is used to create the bones of the website that you're going to. Then there's something called CSS. It's called cascading style sheets. Cascading style sheets give your website color, quite literally, right? So if you want to change the background color, if you want to change the radius of boxes, if you want to be able to do image overlays or any of that kind of stuff, that's done with a language called CSS. Then beyond that, again, what's called a front-end programming language in the web browser. If you want some more interactivity, basically verifying that if somebody puts in an email address into an HTML form, that it actually looks like an email address, that is something called form validation, and you would use a programming language called JavaScript in order to do things like form validation, right? And so that's just the page that you're looking at. Then when you hit submit, right? And basically you send data to the web server. On the web server side, you're going to have what's called a back-end programming language. So in the modern world, it might be something called Node.js. It's a JavaScript framework. We'll talk about that later. It might be a programming language called Python. That's what we use here a lot at Silicon Dojo. It might be something called PHP. But basically the information comes in from the web page back to the server, and then you have this back-end programming language that then reads the information that's coming back, parses the information that's coming back, and then does something with it, right? Many times it'll be interacting with a database. So you'll have something called a relational database. A relational database uses a language called SQL, structured query language. So you have your back-end programming language send what's called a SQL statement to that relational database, and that's how you interact with the database. So when you say, what programming language do I need to learn? It's HTML and CSS and JavaScript and a back-end language and SQL at the minimum. But the other thing you have to be thinking about, again, if you're dealing with an overall platform, you'll most likely have this on an operating system, right? There's a good chance you'll have to interact with the operating system. So then you also have to understand how to do things like command line tasks. So if you're using a Linux operating system, to be able to understand basically how to send commands to what's called the command line in order to interact with that operating system. And so that's something to consider as you start learning these programming languages. Do not hyper-focus on this idea of what language do I need to learn. Again, focus more on the idea of what problem am I trying to solve, and then what tools basically with these programming languages do I need to pull in order to be able to solve those problems. The next thing to think about with these programming languages is for some reason, some people kind of sort of think that they're married to programming languages. Like if you learn Python, you're going to be coding in Python for 20 years. Or if you learn JavaScript, your entire life is just going to be a world of JavaScript. The important thing I want you to understand with these programming languages is that you are not married to them. You can learn a programming language, and if that doesn't do what you need it to do, you can go on to another programming language. So again, all of these languages are going to be designed to solve certain types of problems, but many of them basically use the same types of components to actually do whatever it is they need to do. So there's something called if-else statements or if-else statements. So almost every programming language has those types of statements. There's going to be things called loops. So basic loop is where you continuously do something until a condition is met. All programming languages are going to have loops. Things like conditionals. There's something called a conditional. If this equals this or is greater than this or whatever else, do something else. That's something called a conditional. Variables, functions, these things called classes. Almost all programming languages are going to have these basic concepts. How they actually implement them, something called a syntax, may be different. So an important thing to think about is like, when you're going to learn a programming language, I do want you to think about what type of problem you're trying to solve, and then as close as you understand it, match the programming language you're learning to the types of problems that you're going to try to solve. But realize if you're off for some reason, right? You go off, you learn Ruby on Rails in the 2020s for some reason, right? It doesn't mean you're married to Ruby on Rails. You can take the skills that you have gotten learning that, and then you can go over to Python, you can go over to Java, you can go over to any one of these other programming languages, and you will be ahead of the ball, right? It'll take you a little time to get used to the syntax and get used to the quirks of the programming language, but it's not like you're stuck to this one programming language if you start with one. So do not feel like you have to be married to any of these languages. Basically use it for as long as it's useful for you, and then go on to the next one when it's time. The final thing to be thinking about with a programming language is that all of these different programming languages use what is called a syntax. So what basically syntax is, think of it as the grammar and punctuation of the programming world. And all the different languages basically have their own grammar and they have their own punctuation, something called things like delimiters, right? Basically when a line of code is over. So when you look at JavaScript or when you look at Python, both of those programming languages will have things like loops and if-else statements, but then how that actually gets written out is going to be ever so slightly different. Again, in the Python world, instead of it being an if, else statement, it's an if, else statement. It's one of those weird things, and basically the syntax in Python actually uses indentation to signify where code blocks are. Whereas if you go to like JavaScript, basically, again, these things called delimiters, you use semicolons to show essentially where a code block is. And so one of the things that you're going to find is that you are going to like some programming languages and you're going to hate others. What is the right answer here? There is no right answer, but again, it's one of those things, you're just going to sit down and some of these languages, even if they're a little hard, you may not know them to begin with, you're gonna be like, yeah, I can learn this, like I can do something good with this language. And other languages, no matter how long you use them, you're just gonna bitch and complain and scream because for whatever reason, it doesn't make sense to your brain. Again, that's one of the things for me. Like I like Python. When I look at Python, it seems nice, it seems logical. Even if I messed something up and I have to do troubleshooting, it's not so bad. I'm pretty comfortable. I'll be able to figure out what's going on, right? I sit down and I look at JavaScript and I just want to scream. I just want to scream, no. What did I do to have to deal with this crap? To be clear, that is my personal opinion. I know a lot of people who love JavaScript and absolutely hate Python. And so that's one of the things that you also have to consider. Again, when you think about if you're going to become a professional programmer or even a technology professional, one of the things to be thinking about is, again, what are you going to not necessarily enjoy every day, but be relatively comfortable with every day? And what you're going to find is, again, certain languages are just kind of logical and easy for you, and other languages just no matter how many times you look at them, it's just like, why? This is just the worst, absolute worst way to do anything, right? And that's just going to be a personal thing for you to figure out. So if you're going along and you're learning a language and it seems to be doing good for you, great, keep learning it. But if for some reason you just got one of those mental blocks and you just can't get the language through your head, it might be time to look at a different programming language. And it might not be that you hate programming, you just might hate JavaScript. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about with the whole concept of what is a programming language is the idea of why should a systems administrator learn a programming language at this point in time. So again, I got my MCSE in NT4 back in 2000. Well over 20 years at this point, right? And when I got my MCSE, we did not have to know programming languages. Frankly, we didn't have to know Linux, we didn't have to know Mac. We just had to know our Active Directory in the Windows world because that's all that mattered. But decades have gone by, how we administer systems has changed, and what you find in the modern world is that many times the ways that we administer systems and how we implement systems now, we actually do this with code. We either do this with code or code-like syntax type of deal, things called YAML files we might talk about later. And so one of the things to be thinking about if you simply want to be a systems administrator, right? I just want to administer servers. I don't know, is that still a job? Maybe. Let's just say you can go out and just get a job administering servers. The thing I want you to think about with learning a programming language is that it will be easier for you to administer servers if you understand how programming works. There's something called orchestration in the modern world. So whether you're using Ansible, Puppet was around, Chef was around, there's a lot of different what are called orchestration tools out there. And basically what these orchestration tools allow you to do is they allow you to manage a number of servers at the same time instead of by hand or whatever, managing one or two servers. Basically, you're able to put 10 or 20 or hundreds of servers into an inventory in one of these systems, and then basically you're able to trigger tasks to fire off on these different servers to accomplish whatever tasks it is that you want to do. The thing to understand is when you do this kind of orchestration work, basically that is going to be, it's actually going to either actually be code or it will be very code-like. So if you understand how programming works, and especially if you know a programming language, life is going to be a lot easier for you. Again, it is important to understand with good old school like system administration or network administration, that type of thing, that time has gone by, right? 20 some odd years ago, you could just have your CCNA and you could make money. You could be a middle-class tech professional with just your CCNA. But time has gone by, right? You need to have a lot of other skills now. Having coding in your toolbox for going forward in your professional life is going to be incredibly useful for you for any number of things. And so that's the final thing to be thinking about when you're looking at programming. If you say, you know, hey, I want to be a technology professional, I don't really care about this coding thing, there is a legitimate question in the modern world of if you're actually allowed to say that. You can not code. You know, employers can also not hire you. And so just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about whether or not you really want to learn programming. So that's a basic idea of what programming is and why it's important. I will tell you, learning to program, at least at the basic skill level, does not take a lot of time. Most of these programming language you can learn to an amateur level, at least within 40 hours. You sit down, you block out a week or two in order to learn Python or to learn C# or whatever else. You do some projects, you play around with it, and you should be relatively comfortable with it after about 40 hours. That's the other thing too, again, with learning these different programming languages. It's not like it's going to take you, a year to learn C# and then a year to learn Java and another year to learn JavaScript, right? It's going to take you a few weeks to learn C#. It's going to take you a lot more time to get comfortable with C#. But then if you need to hop over to a different programming language, again, it will take you time to get up to speed and learn the quirks. Everything in the technology does have quirks, but it's probably not going to be that absolutely horrible. Again, that's the thing with the system administrators and other technology professionals out there. A lot of folks are like, I don't want to go through the rabbit hole of learning how to program, but it's about 40 hours, right? Just like you would learn any other product in about 40 hours, that's about what it'll take for a programming language. Again, with the skill set and your actual experience, that will take a little bit longer. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is not an insurmountable task. This is not going to take you a decade or 5 years or anything else. You can, and I actually have seen in the real world, I have seen people who do not know how to program to going to six-figure, $100,000 a year jobs literally within a year, simply because it's surprisingly easy to go from point A to point B. People just don't realize it.